we can't reason unless we have emotions as the foundation to value thoughts. Therefore, emotions are foundational to reason, not the other way around. Well, that's a subtle thought, but it's a very powerful thought. And the moment you realize that your emotions are not inferior, in fact, they're superior, uh, you you start to subtly change your life.
Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges, as he explores turning the page on his life and yours.
Hi, all, and welcome to the next chapter with Charlie. We are excited about our new guest today. Our guest is Doug Earl Johnson, who wrote truly, when I say a brilliant book, I mean a brilliant book titled Choosing Emotions. Over a multi-decade career spanning banking, private equity, and litigation consulting, Doug developed a deep interest in language, motivation, and emotional definition. His wonderful book, Choosing Emotions, represents 9 years of research across disciplines and traditions. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Doug. With that, let's bring out Doug Johnson on the show. Doug, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Charlie, thanks for being there and having me on your show. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. You know, as we were chatting, my listeners know I always chat with guests before the show, and you told me in our chat that people struggle with being able to define how they feel, and then you said, if you can put words to your emotions, you will be a lot happier. Why don't we start with that and let you move forward?
You were right on it with that bit of background and so forth. As you mentioned, I spent 9 years and something like 8,000 or 9,000 hours researching a book. It, like many books, developed almost by accident. I had a conversation with my daughter, who was then in 10th grade. She had been out of school for a month, was feeling sad, and asked me what I knew about depression. Well, as a corporate executive in banking and finance and private equity and working with law firms every day, I didn't have much time for depression. And truth is, I didn't know much about it at all. And I told her I would put on my research hat and go back to work to help understand what it was she was facing. So days later, surrounded by books and articles and laptops digging into what depression was, I realized quickly that dry scientific definitions of words aren't all that helpful if you have an issue. What's really helpful is the quotes of people who have experienced that emotion. And so I found in a short period of time 3 quotes about depression that were very helpful. The first of which is from a writer that you may know. His name is Rollo May.
Right.
He was one of the first self-help writers in history in the 1950s, before self-help was even known as a term. He had his PhD and a degree in divinity. He had survived depression, and his quote was, "Depression is the inability to construct a future." And the moment I read it, I went, my gosh, what a powerful quote. And I jotted it down on a Post-it note. A couple of days later, I came across another quote about depression, also from a survivor. That person's name you will know for sure is J.K. Rowling. She's obviously the author of the Harry Potter series. She became the most successful novelist in world history. Her quote.
Oh, really?
Yes.
In world history?
In world history, yeah. She's a billionaire. So when she was a young woman, before she became a successful writer and novelist, had suffered terribly from depression. Her quote about depression is that absence of being able to envision you will ever be cheerful again. It's the most unpleasant thing I've ever experienced. Well, that quote got my attention also. I wrote it on a Post-it note. And then a couple of days after that, another quote from a freelance writer. You wouldn't have heard of her, but Haley Cornell is her name. She's a very talented writer. she too had survived depression, and her quote was, "Depression lies. It tells you that you've always felt this way and you always will, but you haven't and you won't." Those three quotes suddenly immersed me in what it really meant to feel depression. I hadn't been around it. I didn't have friends that had suffered from it. I knew vaguely that it was a period of
Really?
sadness, but I didn't really know it. And suddenly I sort of knew it. And so here I am sitting
And
at
this
my
was like
desk.
a decade ago?
This was 10 years ago, better part of 10 years ago. My daughter was then, had been out of school for a month with an injury followed by an unrelated surgery. And in 10th grade, a month is a lifetime. So she wasn't sure what she was dealing with. But so I texted her these three quotes. She was sitting in classroom and I texted them to her. I pressed send. And minutes later, Charlie shouldn't have been looking at her cell phone, but she was. And she responded effectively, "Wow, these are really helpful." And so we were onto something. She quickly recovered from her issues, but the idea of defining emotions, which are chronically undefined or underdefined in the literature, the idea of defining them through the quotes of people who've experienced them was a first. We were really onto it. And so I took the idea and morphed from depression to anxiety to codependence to grief to embarrassment to lighter hearted things like joy and zeal and excitement and enthusiasm. Ultimately, 9 years later, I had created, with my daughter's impetus, what might be really the first ever pure dictionary about emotions, but defined by the way they feel, not by the way they look. So, Charlie, when you and I pick up a dictionary, it is what something looks like. It's the
Right.
scientific
Right.
what it
It's an
looks like.
observer outside
But
looking in.
yeah, but this is from the inside looking out. So
Right.
wouldn't you want to hear about love? You'd obviously want to hear what the poets have said. But I came up with 8,000 different quotes covering 272 different emotions.
8,000 quotes.
8,000 quotes. I mean, I was on a quest, and it may be a little bit nutty in a way, but reading the quotes of people who've experienced an emotion, whether it's love or excitement or empathy or karmic states or abundance or curiosity or forgiveness or you name it, was very, very enlightening, and it's very fun. And so rather than call it a dictionary, the nickname became to call it an emotionary. And it might be the most fun dictionary you ever read in your life. A good friend of mine says, you can pick up one page on a given emotion and find 20 to 25 quotes from thought leaders around the world of every walk of life. And it's really, really entertaining. He calls it the best bathroom book in history. Um, and it is. I mean, you can spend 5 minutes with a specific emotion that's on your plate at the time, or you can spend a few hours seeing what some of the great minds, and they might be scientists, they might be politicians, they might be uh, actors, they might be artists, you name it, all walks of life, all faiths, all genders, all religions, what each of them said about a specific emotion. And it's darn fun. I mean, and it's extremely enlightening. I'll give you an example. So, love, obviously, love comes to mind as a top emotion. You might think, well, gee, I want to read what Shakespeare or some of the great poets of history have said. I came across a quote from Walt Whitman, who lived in the 1800s. You're probably well familiar with him. He's known in some circles as the poet laureate of America, and I have developed a real fondness for him among many, many other contributors. But when he was asked about love, he didn't say love is or love is like. His response was about love. He said, "We were together. I forget the rest." Well,
That's great.
what a beautiful way
Yeah, that is
to
a beautiful
express
way.
what love is. I have been
Yes.
hard pressed to find anybody who came up with a more beautiful expression for what love is than that. And there are quite a few. So whether it's love or empathy or excitement or joy or wonder or zeal or anxiety, or grief, 272 different emotions as seen through the eyes of capable people who have experienced them. It's really enlightening, and it's fun to read.
Um, you write the subtitle of the book. I like the subtitle a lot: "Thinking with Your Head and Acting with Your Heart." It's a really wonderful subtitle. And then you you talk that emotions are foundational to reason. Tell me about that. How emotions are foundational because you think they're separate activities.
You, you do. So emotions often, as you and I know, and your audience knows, often get a bad rap. You'll be talking about a colleague, and somebody says, "Well, Mary, she's so emotional," or "Bill, he's so emotional, he flies off the handle." And so we are generally led to think that when we are at our best, we are not emotional. That is to say, when we're at our best, we're more rational and logical, and then emotions are sort of pesky, inferior states. I mean,
And
that's not.
as if being logical is superior to feeling something.
Yes,
That's a
exactly. And
grand
so
assumption right there.
it's a grand assumption, and in part it's reinforced by the old decades old TV show Star Trek, where you had Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock, and he was constantly rational and logical, and he would occasionally roll his eyes at these humans and their pesky emotions. And it's not uncommon at all for the average person. Nobody's average, but for the average person to think, if I'm going to live at my highest and best, I'm going to be rational and logical, and occasionally I might succumb to emotions. But the absolute unanimity among the scientific community is the opposite is true. So I'm
Oh,
gonna I'm
really?
gonna I'm gonna add a few uh, top thought leaders in science. So the near unanimity, virtual unanimity in the scientific community is that
And you
emotions are
discovered
not.
that the unanimity over 9 years of research. It just kept
Yes,
coming on
yes,
you.
and I'll give you certain names. So whether you're talking about Antonio Damasio, who is uh, teaches neuroscience at USC in LA, he is a Honda Prize winner, which is the equivalent of Nobel in his circles. Whether it's him or Jonathan Haidt, who teaches psychology at NYU in New York City, or Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner from Princeton, uh, there is virtual unanimity that emotions are foundational to logic. They are not inferior to logic, they are foundational to logic. What do I mean by that? Antonio Damasio at USC, the neuroscience scientist, developed a theory which he tested and proved that if you are disconnected from your emotional um, thought processes, you can't reason. You're presented facts, and his patients who had their effective emotions cut off and were tested were not able to select between A, B, or C. And the core reason, as Dr. Damasio pointed out, was that emotions give us the framework for valuing thoughts. And so we can't reason unless we have emotions as the foundation to value thoughts. Therefore, emotions are foundational to reason, not the other way around. Well, that's a subtle thought, but it's a very powerful thought. And the moment you realize that your emotions are not inferior, in fact, they're superior, uh, you you start to subtly change your life. Um, Jonathan Haidt at NYU and New York City at Columbia has said it in so many words. It is only because our emotional system works so well that we can reason at all. Well, that's a powerful thought,
So
and that's not.
no wonder you say that if you can't feel, you can't think. If you can't
That's
if you
it.
can't if you can't sense it with your emotion, it puts thought or rational thinking in a whole separate category that's separate from you as a human being.
That's correct. So let's go back to what you said moments ago, which is about subtitle of the book, which is Thinking with Your Head and Acting with Your Heart. Almost none of us, perhaps you did, but I certainly didn't get any real education about emotions. We just learn on the fly. We learn from our siblings, we learn from our parents, we learn at school, we absorb, we navigate, we adjust, we refine. But there are very few things in life that purport to be a handbook about human emotions. And it's not uncommon, I'm sure you've heard it, I certainly have, that a relative might say, well, Charlie, use your head. And another relative might say, follow your heart. Well, there you have it. There are two different parts of us. One is the rational, logical part, and the other is the emotional part. And the truth is that we are happier when we unite both. We are happier when we do both things, when we think with our head and act with our heart. And they have
sort of an integration of feelings and thinking.
Integration of feelings and thinking. And so one of the things that I did in the book is to highlight sort of through the centuries how it is developed in their literature. What is the difference between the head and the heart? So I'm going to give you an example of how they each have their own domain, but they each should work together. The head is often regarded as the seat of facts, thoughts, and knowledge, while the heart is often regarded as the seat of love, emotions, and feelings. So right there you have a duality. The head is in charge generally of one thing. The heart is generally in charge of something else. The head is generally in charge of bodily functions. The heart is generally in charge of the human spirit or the soul. If you were to look into Oxford Dictionary, you'd find the Oxford English Dictionary, which is arguably the number one dictionary in the world. The heart is the seat of the human soul. It's defined there. But to continue, the head is the domain of science, and the heart is the domain of conscience. Interesting.
Of conscience.
The head is in charge of science. The heart is in charge of conscience. The head is in charge of intellect. The heart is in charge of intuition. The head is in charge of belief. The heart is in charge of faith. The head is in charge of words. The heart is in charge of poetry. So there is a duality, and they each have their primary domains. They communicate. The science, and I hesitate to use a term called the science because there is no the science. Science is always evolving. But the latest in science is that the head and the heart communicate constantly. There are, in fact, neurons, which are the cells in your brain that we think allow us to think. They're neurons in your heart. The head and the heart do communicate. And if we can consciously acknowledge that and incorporate the domains of both head and the heart in what we're doing, we're going to be happier people.
Yeah, I personally have realized it was not an intentional effort. It just was, I sort of fell to it. But I just feel my thinking process is an integration, and my head and my heart are one. That my head and my heart dwell in the same place, and they are integrated and swimming alongside each other, and even mating. I've always thought, not always, recently as I've contemplated this, I thought that I naturally integrate reason and feelings.
Well, it's a mark of happiness. It's a mark of great happiness. Some of the greatest thinkers in human history, and we often think of Albert Einstein as the great theoretical physicist who came up with the theory of relativity and quantum physics and the like, and he was a great scientific genius. But the number of quotes that Albert Einstein entered into the public domain, such as "Don't let your head interfere with what your heart already knows." You wouldn't expect Albert Einstein to be saying things like that.
No kidding, really.
But the record is full of Albert Einstein saying emotionally related things like that. So if we're living at our best, we are uniting the head and the heart, which evidently you're already doing. But when you think about it, if you encounter an emotion like greed, almost on its face, you can contemplate that your head and your heart are out of alignment.
Right.
Your heart knows you shouldn't be doing that, but your head says, "Yeah, I can get it. I can get that money." All right. Well, greed is arguably a dysfunction. It's one of many, many, many emotions. All of them have value, but all of them are.
She said, let me stop you real quickly because that's even funny right there that you would call greed an emotion. Greed does not feel like an emotion to me,
And yet it is.
but it is. It is.
It is.
Yes.
And so, since you mentioned that, the average person, and I hasten to add, there is no such thing as an average person, but collectively we can talk about
Right.
averages. The average American, the average human being, if you query this, how many emotions are there? The average answer is between 6 and 24 emotions total. And yet, in the book, I document everyday emotions, 272, and I think more likely they're in the low hundreds, even more than 272. These are, Charlie, not complex, obscure emotions. These are everyday emotions like blushing or flirtation or confidence or bullying or narcissism or joy or zeal, provocation, resentment, forgiveness, empathy. We live with these emotions so conveniently that we often don't even realize we're in them.
Yeah. And they don't even realize they're emotions.
We don't even
Like,
realize their emotions. And so the average person underestimates how many emotions are there. As I just said, if you were to Google right now at your search bar, how many emotions does the average person believe exist? Depending upon the day, Google or AI will respond either 6 or up to 28. I mean, that's depending on the day, you'll get a different answer. But that's all right. Well, but that's demonstrably not true. I have quotes from 8,000 normal, everyday people attesting to at least in the low hundreds of emotions. And again, these are not acronyms. These are normal, everyday. You recognize it
regular. Yeah.
regular, every day, recognize it in yourself, your friends, your family, but you just don't realize it. And so part of the book is to really analyze what emotions are. They are chronically underdefined. But what emotions really are, in my research, is that they are our operating system. And if
Oh,
you think about
okay.
you're there in front of your laptop, you've got peripherals, printers, you've got software feeding it. Our emotional system is not unlike the biological equivalent of a computer operating system. There are peripherals that feed it, the central processor information, the central processor analyzes the data, issues commands. Well, that's really what our emotions are doing. Our emotions represent our operating system that allow us to analyze, assess, and act. Our emotions protect us. Number one, they keep us away from bad stuff like touch a hot stove, you won't do that again. Hang around angry, arrogant, aggressive people, you want to move away. So emotions protect us, number one. They keep us away from bad stuff,
Hmm.
but they also allow us to investigate things that advance our lives. Good stuff like love, curiosity, wonder, zeal, excitement, enthusiasm, on and on and on. All right. So emotions do two things. Number one, first and foremost, always number one is they protect us. Number two of which is that they allow us to advance our lives. And if you understand that emotions are both things, you're going to be happier. An average response is, well, I can't help my emotions. I just react. Well, but you can, and you do. We all do. If you touch a hot stove, of course you're going to react. But you also can use your emotions to fall in love, to read a book, to sing, to dance, to call a friend.
Right.
Those
Right.
are all things that allow you to navigate away from bad stuff and toward good stuff. So emotions, as I call them, are the gears of life. They allow us to proceed, withdraw, move forward, stay stationary, move to the left or right. Emotions are our gears of life. They're our operating system.
but we must evaluate our emotions at some point, because isn't there a downside to being, as you described in earlier, to being too emotional, where
Sure. As with anything, any sort of excess is likely to land you in trouble or in confusion. But if you understand that emotions are your friends, and even the tough ones, even grief, even frustration, those are signals to you to
oh,
move in a
those are
different
your
direction.
great teachers.
Those are your great teachers. And if you accept them, even the bad ones, the so called bad ones, as teachers, you will understand, and I think you already do, that emotions are our friends. Everybody on earth has an inner voice. It's your thinking voice. When you're alone in your bedroom, in your car, in your shower, and you're thinking, that's your inner voice. Well, the latest from the scientific community, including Dr. Ethan Kross, who teaches, professor of psychology at Michigan, University of Michigan, has written a couple of New York Times bestsellers. Everyone has an inner voice, and the goal is to make friends with your inner voice. The goal is
Right, right,
your inner voice
right.
should be your best friend. Uh,
You
and,
know,
and
I've
when you,
written I've written a blog, making demons your friends, and those are it's very very similar to what you're saying. You're taking, because your demons are emotional typically,
well,
and
it's beautifully said. We can start with the notion that your inner voice can and should be your best friend. That emotions are not to be afraid of. They are your friends. They are your navigational devices. I'm going to use that word again because it's really, really helpful. When you and I talk with others about, well, how did you navigate that situation with your boss? Or how did you navigate that situation with your teenager? How we're navigating is with our emotions. That is the substance of our navigation, is through our emotions. That's how we navigate our lives. And uh, it's a real eye opener when you understand that you navigate with emotions. They are your operating system. They're your friends. They're the gears of life that allow you to pull away from things that aren't helpful to you and move toward things that are. Suddenly, that's a subtle shift that changes your life.
do you think there was a time, we live in this post-enlightenment period, that in the whole idea of enlightenment, the head is everything is logical and definable, and do you think, was there a time preceding the enlightenment that people were more attentive to emotions? I think I read the late medieval Christian mystics,
Right,
1200 to just 1200 to 1500,
right.
and there's a lot of emotion that's coming from mystics.
I love the question. I tend to think, having studied now 25 centuries of thought leaders, whether it's poets or philosophers or scientists or theologians, I tend to think that the emotion versus science issues go up and down over the centuries.
Okay,
Uh, but I think in the current culture, the number of times you and I hear comments about the science is definitive. Well, I'm not so sure that's either correct, because science is always evolving.
right,
Um, but
right.
but I think that the tip top of science right now acknowledges that emotions are superior and foundational. I don't know that the average American understands that science, the top scientists at the moment, all of them, agree that emotions are foundational. And when the average person, nobody's average, but when a normal, regular person, the type that you see, every day,
Someone like
understands that,
myself, I
like,
consider myself a normal person.
well, and you are, you're unique in many ways and normal in others. But uh, when you realize that emotions are superior, not to be relegated as, gee, that's really inferior. If I'm living well, I should be reasonable and logical all the time. Once you understand that emotions are primary, foundational, and your friend, it's a really important fundamental shift. And so then you look at life as, hey, I am fundamentally emotional. Let me give you an example of that. A normal person, an average person, somebody you meet in the grocery store or on the street, if you ask them, they would say, you ask them how many emotions are there, they might answer, well, I think there are maybe a couple dozen. But their response would generally be, emotions are rare things. Tuesday, I was annoyed with my teenager. Last night, my wife was very happy because she bought something on sale. That we tend to regard emotions as sporadic and very infrequent. The reality is that all day, every day, you and I are navigating life by transitioning from one emotion to the next. I'll give you an example.
I just want to say
Let-
that's a brilliant observation. That is a
well,
brilliant
thank you,
observation.
and I honestly think it's pretty unique. I've not found it anywhere else, but I'm going to give you an example. Let's say it's Saturday afternoon. You're sitting alone in your living room, nobody else in the house, just you, and you're bored. So you're bored. You pick up the TV remote and you say, well, I'll see what's on TV. You've moved from boredom to curiosity. You press click. The TV comes on. You're curious. You're seeing what's on TV, and what you see is a sports event where one team is way ahead of the other, and you go, gee, that's not interesting. You're disinterested. You change the channel. You see another rerun. You go, you know what? Not much on TV. I'm bored again. You set down the remote. You think, wait a minute. I wonder what's going on in the kitchen. You're back to curiosity. You wander in the kitchen. You see the refrigerator. Aha, excitement. I wonder if that goodie that I left in there last night is still there. You open the refrigerator door. Even more excitement. There is the goodie. You reach for it. Your cell phone goes off. You're annoyed. It's a telemarketer. You quickly figure out how to dismiss with the telemarketer, and it's back to your goodie satisfaction. You eat it. And yet that's done, and you're bored again. And so you reach for your cell phone. You say, I'm going to call Bill and see if he wants to go to the gym. Your curiosity. My point is pretty clear. We're constantly shifting from one emotion to the next all day, every day. That's how we live our lives. That's why emotions are fundamental. They're not sporadic things that happen every Tuesday or Thursday evening. They're all day, every day. And that's, I think, Charlie, maybe a revelation. Not
Yeah,
many people.
I'm wondering as you're talking, you're using the word curiosity, and this is a good word to play with for a moment. Because is curiosity a thought or a feeling?
It's a feeling. It's a feeling. I mean, the book includes 272 emotions or emotional states. So, to answer your question, I think without a question, when you read the quotes of people, the 20 or 25 quotes about curiosity, you'll see readily that it is an emotion. But you could argue for a moment that it's an emotional state. It doesn't matter in my world, in my view, whether it's an emotion or emotional state.
Yeah, what's it?
Karma.
Who cares?
Karma is an emotional state. Charisma is an emotional state. But when you read the quotes of people who've experienced those emotions or emotional states, you go, yeah, that's what I was thinking. And yet, so often, people before you and I, Charlie, have come up with quotes and phrases that the minute you read it, you go, aha. Not unlike Walt Whitman saying love, we were together, I forget everything else. Winston Churchill, you and I both know as the famous Prime Minister of England during World War II. You may not recall that he also won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was an exceptional speaker and writer. And during World War II, as Prime Minister, in the early 1940s, the Nazis were trying to scare the bejabbers out of England. I think Hitler, the record reflects that Hitler and his senior staff were hopeful that England would surrender and not go to war. And so every night, the Nazis were sending buzz bombs into London. These were unmanned flying bombs that would land in neighborhoods and just blow up a house indiscriminately. And people were terrified. Every night, the buzz bombs would land, and you'd wake up one morning and your neighbor might be dead, and you wondered if you were next. So that was an era before television, of course, in the early 1940s. And Churchill went on the BBC radio for a broadcast to the nation to calm them down. And he uttered 8 words that I think are, 8 really sensational words to summarize the scene. He said to the nation on the radio, "Fear is a reaction, courage is a decision." And those are 8 pretty powerful words. Most of us often think that emotions are reaction. Fear is a reaction. But he quickly pointed out that you don't have to stay there. You can actually decide to be courageous or to be curious or to get out of your house or to do it, whatever. But emotions are both a reaction and they're a decision. And that's why I named the book Choosing Emotions.
I was just going to say, no wonder the title is perfect for what your studies.
Indeed it is, because I wanted to emphasize that when we're at our best, we're not reacting. We're not reacting as victims. We are choosing as victors. I'm going to say that again. We're not reacting as victims. When we're at our best, we're choosing emotions as victors. And it's a subtle point, but a darn important one.
Can you give me an illustration of choosing an emotion in everyday life?
I can. I had an experience in the corporate world where I was in the next office to the CEO of a major company. And one morning he came in and saw that people just weren't working. I mean, people were just arriving late to work and drinking coffee and chatting, but work wasn't getting done. And I could tell at a glance that it really irked him. And I asked him, I said, I can see at a glance that you're upset by this. Do you want me to put out an email to the staff about, you get to work at exactly on time, and, your job is your job. It isn't to chat, drinking coffee and talking about last night's Lakers game. It's to do the job. And he came up with, he said, no, thank you to me. He came up with a different outcome. I knew that he was very angry. I could tell at a glance he was very angry. There was no mistaking it. He was not happy to see the staff goofing off. But he came up with in the course of 5 minutes, standing in his office, he came up with a solution that instantly transformed the morale and demeanor of the entire company.
No kidding.
I don't mean to be secretive about it, but it was, I greatly admired what he did. Instantly, within 5 minutes, everybody was back at their desk and everybody got the message by what he did and said, don't do that again. Well, the point to answer your question is he was angry, but he chose a different route. He chose to inspire them. So instead of choosing anger, get back to your work, which I knew was on his mind, he chose to inspire them. And I think everybody got that message, right? So he chose one emotion over another. And I greatly admired that in him.
See, you know what you're doing too is that you're defining so many acts as an emotion when I've looked at them as a thought or a decision. And you've broadened the scope of emotions radically in my mind. That
I probably have. So pardon me for interjecting. When I finished the book after 9 years, it was published in December and ready for sale in January. I sent a copy of it, a hardbound, just fresh from the printer, to a friend of mine. And I said, hey, you don't mind taking a look at this? And he called me 2 days later and he said, look, I spent the weekend, I looked through your book. It's fascinating. He said, but do yourself a favor and submit it to AI and see what AI thinks of the book. And I was a tiny bit reluctant. I mean, I thought,
of course,
why would I do that? I'm probably going to hear something bad from AI. But the book was 376 pages, is 130,000 words. I had spent 9 years writing it. It was all human interpretations of emotion.
You did all of this in under 400 pages?
I did all this in under 400 pages. And so here I am standing at my laptop. I have an electronic version of the book from the publisher, and I thought, well, why not? I'm happy with the book. I'll submit it to Claude AI and ChatGPT and see what they think. So I finally get up the nerve and I press send, and minutes later,
Minutes.
probably 2 minutes later, the response came back from each of them on two different laptops. They each said, this is the single most comprehensive reference book on emotions in the English language. Charlie, I could not have been more surprised. That was not what I thought I had written. That was not my intention. But it highlights just what you just said, which is that most people underestimate either the role of emotions in their lives or how many emotions there are. And they really are tools. And so by accident, I had written the first ever emotionary. That's a term we came to use to describe it instead of dictionary. The first ever emotionary, where you can't argue it. I mean, you read the quotes and you go, of course that's an emotion. Of course that's an emotion. I just hadn't thought about it. But it's really fun reading.
You told me that I believe there was an author you were quoting that you said you need to name it to tame
Yeah.
it.
What a great
Tell me
question.
about
Right.
that.
I will. So I've alluded earlier that the scientific community is in unanimity that emotions are foundational to reason. That's true at the Nobel level and similar level. But one of the great New York Times best-selling writers is a guy, a doctor, a psychiatrist by the name of Dan Siegel. He's affiliated with UCLA. He's written a number of New York Times bestsellers. He's got that rare gift of being a scientist who also can communicate really easily. And in his work as a clinical psychiatrist and in his book, he came up with a term that I think should be cast in stone. It's 5 words: name it to tame it. Dan Siegel is his name. Dan Siegel's name it to tame it, one of the great phrases of history. And it's because in his clinical work with his colleagues in doing functional magnetic resonance imaging, so that's fMRI, an acronym. I stay away from them, but it's worth mentioning. He and his team found that patients are calmer when they can put words to their emotions. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that you or I get a diagnosis, a preliminary diagnosis from a doctor. We have an illness. And if you'll come back next Thursday, we'll tell you what it is. Well, you and I have each been in that circumstance where, those are miserable days. What might I have? You're trying to read online, educate yourself. Well, 3 days later, you arrive in the doctor's office. You've had terrible fright over what you might have or not have. And the doctor says, well, the good news is that it's pretty minor. And with this medication, you'll be fine. Okay. Suddenly you're calmer. Suddenly the question marks in your mind that you've been racing over are gone. You've replaced a question mark or a series of question marks with a period or an exclamation point. I don't have something that I'm going to die from. I have this.
Right.
And if I take that, I'll be fine. All right.
Right.
Well, Dr. Siegel found that, not really, especially focusing on medical issues, any time that you ask yourself, why do I feel this way? What's up with me? What's my problem? If you can replace that with, my problem is I feel frustrated, or my problem is I'm anxious, or the moment you can attach words to it, you are calmer and you are happier. So name it to tame it. You probably know the best-selling writer, psychologist Brene Brown.
Right.
She's written 7 New York Times bestsellers. She's done TED Talks and the like. Here's her quote about that topic. This is from Brene Brown. Language is our portal to meaning making. Language is our portal to meaning making. Having access to the right words can open up entire universes. Putting words to issues, emotions, is extremely important. Charles Kettering, you may know of the Sloan Kettering Cancer Clinic in New York City. He was not a physician. he was an engineer who was chief of design for General Motors. He owned 186 patents, Charlie, so he knew something about problems and thinking. Here's his great quote: "A problem well stated is a problem half solved."
Right.
When
That's
you
great.
when Isn't that a brilliant,
Yeah. Yeah.
simple?
That's really wonderful.
A problem well stated is a problem half solved. If you can sit down in your bedroom, in your car, with your best friend, with your spouse, and simply say, "You know what, honey, I'm really frustrated by this," suddenly your temperature goes down. You're calmer. You're starting to deal with a known thought versus a question mark. Um, William Shakespeare in Hamlet writes, "Suit the action to the word and the word to the action." Words are how we solve problems. You might think that a nuclear physicist thinks in terms of square root symbols and the like, and they do to a degree. But here's a quote from Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel
Right.
Prize in nuclear physics. Here's his quote: "What is it that we human beings ultimately depend upon? We depend upon our words. We are suspended in language." It's words
Niels
that
Bohr
calm us.
said that. Yeah.
Niels Bohr, nuclear physicist. He was a colleague of
Yeah.
Albert Einstein,
Right.
right?
Right. Well, I think you have given tons of reasons why we should purchase and read Choosing Emotions. I have on the show notes when we post the episode, I have a link to Amazon so people can get it right from Amazon. Uh, I think you have a brilliant book, and I really think our listeners should read it. And I like this. I like this idea. I like this closing idea of naming it, of understanding, to being able to define something. And if you can name something, if you can describe it, if you can name it and describe it, you're halfway to solving for whatever issue you already have, because you know what you're dealing with.
You'll find that that's true. Whether your concern at the moment is love or curiosity or anxiety or depression, you can look through the quotes of 20 thought leaders before you, and you might say, "Gee, that quote number 7, that's exactly what's on my mind," because that person's already been there before.
Yeah.
And it will help you if you are at all embarrassed or reluctant to put things in words. The book provides an absolutely simple way of seeing what other people before you have said about that emotion, or maybe you're not dealing with that emotion at all. Maybe it's a different one. The book is laid out A to Z, abundance through zeal. Each emotion is roughly a page or two long. It's really, really simple to bring yourself up to speed on what people before you have seen and experienced, and it's very fun to read.
Yeah. I want to encourage all of our listeners to check it out. At least go to Amazon and check it out.
Thank you. So it's Choosing Emotions, Thinking with Your Head and Acting with Your Heart. The website is choosingemotions.com. The book is available in hardback, paperback, Kindle. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Ingram Spark, and a number of places. I'm repeating myself. It's genuinely a fun read and an enlightening read.
Well, Doug, thank you for coming on the show today. It's been a delight chatting with you.
Charlie, it's been my pleasure being here. Thank you so very much for having me.
Okay, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.